In this chapter we'll be going over adding materials and textures to your model. This chapter relates to the Blender internal renderer. The new renderer being developed is called Cycles, and we'll be getting into that in the next volume when we create an acoustic guitar. But for now, this is the default renderer still, so we're going to learn this. We're going to go over the basics of adding materials now. Materials are basically the object's color, but include other attributes like shininess, reflectivity, transparency, and a lot more. So open up the blend file, blend. This is our testing ground. We're going to add different materials and textures to each of the objects here. First, so that we can preview our materials and lighting better, go into the sidebar here and make sure GLSL is enabled as the shading type. This will give us a pretty good preview of what the final materials and lighting will look like. Now, GLSL doesn't work for every graphics card, but it's not necessary. It's simply for previewing purposes. So if it's not working for you, then in order to see your final materials and textures, you'll just simply have to render it. Also note that if you're using Blender 2.69 or a later version, the shading options are now in their own shading panel beneath the display panel. Now press F12 and let's see what this looks like right off the bat. You'll see that aside from the shadows in the render, the 3D view is pretty much the same. Of course, the render is a lot better, but this gives us a pretty accurate representation of what the final render will look like. And that's because of GLSL being enabled as the shading type. So let's start with the torus. Select the torus and go to the material buttons, which is this red circle icon here. Click on the new button to add a new material. Let's rename this torus. Here we have a preview of what the material looks like. And the diffuse panel here is basically where we set the color for the object. For the material, I mean. So click on the color field here, and you'll have a pinwheel with all the different colors, and a slider to the right for the brightness of the color. So let's make our torus a nice bright purple. Just mouse away from that and it'll disappear. Now the intensity value here is the amount of reflected light. If you crank that up all the way, it's going to be the brightest purple it can be. And if you bring that down to 0, it's going to be black. So let's bring that up all the way to 1. Now the menu next to the color is the shader type. There's a few different shaders here, and they all basically calculate the light a different way. And there's even a tune shader, which will make the lighting appear flat on your object. So if you enable tune shading and change the size, you'll kind of get an idea of what that does. And change the smoothness down to 0, and we get real sharp edges around there. If you rotate the scene and choose the light and move it around, you'll see how it affects the tune shading. It's pretty cool. And you can achieve some pretty cool effects with the other shaders like mini-art. Bringing darkness down to 0 kind of gives this light rim around the object. And cranking it up kind of makes some dark spots. I'm not sure how this shader works, but it can create some cool looks. But for now we're going to stick with Lambert. So the diffuse panel is essentially where you set the color for your object. Let's move down to the specular panel. This is where we define the shininess, where the light reflects off of the surface. Select the lamp again and move it around. The white spots on the torus, that's the specularity, and that's what we're going to be changing now. So select the torus again. And there's a color field for specular as well, where you can change the color of that shiny spot. And the intensity value is how strong the shiny spot is. So 1 is full specular and 0 is basically turning it off. Let's leave that at 0.5. Now the hardness value defines how sharp or soft the spot is. A higher value will be useful for things like metal and glass, which have sharp specularity, and a lower value would be good for more dull materials like rubber, because it blurs that shiny spot. But if we crank that up to, say, 200, it'll be nice and sharp. but let's leave that at the default of 50. The menu to the right is for different specular shaders. Experiment with these to get a good look. There's even a shader for Toon Specular, which goes well with the Toon Diffuse shader. So the next panel beneath that is for shading options. There's a couple notable options here. One is Emit. If you turn that up, you'll see it lightens the object. This is basically self-illumination. If an object in your scene is a little bit darker than you want it to be, you can just add a little bit of extra light by playing with this value. And the shadeless option over here, if enabled, will render the material just the flat, diffuse color. It won't take into account any lighting or any specular or anything like that. Now let's move on to the monkey head. Let's make this a blue glass. So select the monkey head, go to Material Buttons, and add a new material. Let's change the diffuse color to a deep blue. Whoops, I forgot to increase the brightness all the way. And increase intensity to 1. Now go down to Specular and change the specularity shader to Ward ISO, which is really good for things like glass. You'll see it makes the specular real sharp. And let's change intensity to 0.25 and change the slope to 0.05. That'll make it really small and really sharp. Now go down to the transparency panel and check that box to enable it. By default, it's set at Z transparency, which is strictly about making the object see-through, but this will not reflect the light. So turn alpha down to 0.5 to make this half transparent, and let's render this so you can see what I mean. Now you can see through the monkey head, but it's not exactly glass. It's strictly transparent. It's not refracting any of the light going through it. Let's play with the other settings before we move on to real refraction. Now the Fresnel and blend settings change how transparent on the angle the surface is seen. If we increase Fresnel to 1.5 and increase blend to 1.5 as well, and if you look at the preview pane, you'll see that it's darker around the edges than it is in the middle. It basically makes the borders of the object less transparent than the rest of it. If you turn it to 1, it pretty much makes the borders not transparent at all. So press F12 to render that and see how it looks. You'll see parts of the surface that you can see straight on are fully transparent, but around the borders of the object it's not transparent at all. It's pretty much solid. So that's how Fresnel works with blend. Now the specular field here determines how visible the specularity is on transparent material. Now enable ray trace. Let's make this real glass. The alpha, Fresnel, and blend fields all do the same thing. So let's turn Fresnel and blend back down to 1. And by the way, to copy and paste one value from one field into another, mouse over that field, press Ctrl and C, and mouse over the other field and press Ctrl and V, and it'll paste that value in. That works for things like colors as well. We can copy this blue color and paste it here where the white is. So that's one little tip trick I picked up on. So that's one little tip trick you should know. Alright, let's make perfectly clear glass first. So turn the alpha down to 0. And now scroll down to IOR, or Index of Refraction. This is the value of refraction. Increase this to 1.4. And you'll see the refraction in the preview here. Now let's render this. Now you may need to experiment with different values to get the refraction you're looking for. You can also search online for common values for index of refraction for different materials. Now there's some advanced options over here. Most notable is filter, which by increasing this filters in the diffuse color and gives us a blue glass. So let's change this to 0.5 so we have a pretty well blue tinted piece of glass here. And let's re-render that and see how it looks. Looking pretty cool. So we've got some colored glass now. Now the fall-off value here is for transmissivity, which is supposed to make the glass look thicker because of the light being absorbed into it. Let's leave this at 1, mainly because I don't know how to use it. So moving on. The limit value here defines how far light can go into the glass before being absorbed completely. So parts of any object that are thicker than this value will not be transparent. In essence, the thinner parts of the object will be more transparent than the thicker parts. This only works if the filter value is higher than 0. So increase the limit to 2 and re-render. Notice how the ears are a lot more clear than the head is. That's because they're a lot thinner. So that's what limit does. The last value here is depth. This is the number of times the light bounces around internally. The higher the number, the longer the calculation time, but more realistic the refraction will be. So let's increase this to 6 and re-render. You'll notice the refraction looks a little bit more complex now, especially around the areas of the eye and the eyebrows. It's because light's bouncing around in there a lot more. The last value to talk about is the gloss value over here. This is the sharpness or blurriness of the refraction. Let's decrease this to 0.8. The samples option below defines the quality of the blurriness. The lower the samples, the more grainy it will be. And use caution, any gloss amount less than 1 might significantly increase render time, especially if you increase the samples. So let's re-render and see how that looks. Alright, that took about 4 times longer to render. You can see how everything is kind of blurred now. So you would use this for frosted glass or imperfect glass. Press escape to close that, and I'm going to increase gloss back up to 1 so that the refraction is fully sharp and everything renders quick again. And that does it for our blue glass material. Now select our sphere. Let's make this a reflective chrome ball. So go to the materials buttons and add a new material. Change the diffuse color to a bright white with an intensity value of 1. Change the specular shader to Ward ISO. Change that intensity to 0.25 and change the slope to 0.05 so that it's tighter. Now scroll down to the mirror panel. Let's expand that and enable it by checking that box. So here's all of our reflectivity properties here. We can increase reflectivity with this value right here. So let's increase that to 1. Let's go up to our preview pane and you'll see it's basically a mirror now. Now the color field below that changes the color of the reflection. So real quick, let's make that blue. Let's see how that looks. So you get the idea. I'm going to minimize the shading panel here, just so I can see the mirror panel and the preview pane in the same view. So change that color back to white. Now the Fresnel and blend properties here work the same as they do with refraction. If you increase the Fresnel, then the area around the sphere, on the border of the sphere, will be more reflective than the center area. It all depends on the angle you're looking at it from. So let's increase Fresnel to 1.5 and increase blend to 1.5. So you get the idea here. The part of the sphere you're looking at straight on is going to be less reflective than the sharper angles of the border of it. So just with those settings, let's press F12 and see what it looks like so far. Not bad. See, the area on the border of the sphere is much more reflective than the center. That's how Fresnel works. I'm going to turn Fresnel down a little. I'm going to turn Fresnel to 1.3 and maybe blend to 1.8. Fresnel down to 1. Alright, I'm going to stick with Fresnel at 1.1 and the blend value at 1.8. That way it's more reflective around the borders, and just the area, the dead center, is not reflective at all. Play with those values till you get something you like. Alright, now the depth value here. Depth is the number of inner reflections, basically how many times it can reflect its own reflection. Think of putting two mirrors facing each other and imagine the infinite inner reflections there. The gloss value over here is the amount of blurriness. If you decrease that, the reflections will be more blurry. So let's try that out. Let's decrease that to 0.8. You'll see how much blurrier they got in the preview. And let's render it and see how it looks. This also takes a little bit longer to render if you decrease the gloss for reflections, just like with refractions. So that would be for like a rough metal surface. Let's increase the gloss back up to 1. And let's render our final sphere material. Good. And we're done with that. Now we move on to the box. So select the box in the back now. And let's use some textures. A texture gives your object a unique look. With them you can create leather, brushed aluminum, wood, anything you need your object to be. So let's turn this into a wooden box by using some procedural textures. So first let's add a material for it so that we can add a texture to it. Change the diffuse color to a dark brown. The intensity value of 1. And let's turn specular off by turning it down to 0. This is a block of wood, so it's not going to have much shine to it. Now let's go to the texture buttons, which is this checkerboard icon here. And here we can add textures. So press the new button, and it adds a new texture. And here's our preview panel. There, let's enable both, which will show us both the texture on the left and the texture applied to the material on the right. And let's change the preview type to cube. Since we're applying this material to a box, it makes sense to preview it on a box. So let's change the texture type now from clouds to, well, there's lots to choose from here. Most of these don't really need explanation. You can experiment with these and understand them on your own. But for now, let's choose wood. You'll see it creates some pink bands on your cube. And they're very pink, and I need to change them quickly. So let's scroll all the way down. Click on this field here to change the color of the bands. And let's make it sort of a brownish yellow. Something like that. Let's scroll up and see how that looks. That looks okay. Let's press F12 and see what we've got so far. That looks like crap. I should make them a little bit brighter and more yellow. So I'm going to change that color again to that. That looks better. While we're at it, let's change the wood type from sign to saw, which is just a different way to color it, and it looks a lot better. So now let's press F12 and see what it looks like. Alright, not bad. That's basically it for adding textures. There's lots of procedurals to work with here, and there's lots of options for each one of them. And after you're done playing around with everything, scroll down to look at some more of the options here. Under the influence panel here is where we determine how the texture will affect our material. Right now we have color enabled, so this texture is affecting the color of our material. We could also have it affect specularity, down here, shading, and geometry. We'll be getting into some of that as the volume progresses. And in the next chapter on UV mapping, we'll learn how to add images as textures. Now let's add a second texture to make our box bumpy. We'll add wood. So scroll all the way up to the top, click on the empty slot beneath the texture you just made, and click on the new button to add another texture. Change the texture type to Stucci or Stucky, however you pronounce that. This is the typical texture you'll use for adding bumpiness to objects. Now scroll down to the influence panel and disable color because we don't want this affecting the color. And under the geometry options, check the box next to normal. Scroll up and you'll see in the preview it adds all this bumpiness to the object. Now it doesn't actually affect the mesh, it just changes the way the light reflects off the surface, making it appear that it's bumpy. It's sort of an illusion. So let's press F12 and see how that looks. Alright, we can see, especially on the top, it makes the surface look like it's really bumpy. I need to scale that down a lot to make this look like it's grain instead of the wood being warped. So we can scale this down by changing the sizes here. If we increase the size, it basically tells the texture how many times to repeat, so it makes it smaller. So change the size of X to 5 and Y to 5. And leave Z as 1 so that it's stretched upward. And press F12 and let's see how that looks now. That looks better. I think it's still really bumpy though, way too bumpy. So let's change the normal value here from 1 to 0.3. Just to give it a faint grain look. And that's better. That's good enough. This is just to show you how to add multiple textures to a single object. And how to add bumpiness to the object. Now there's one last thing I want to do in this chapter. I want to show you how to add multiple materials to the same object. First off, when you join two objects together into one mesh, they still maintain their own materials. So for example, if we select the torus, hold shift, and select the cube, and press Ctrl and J to join them together into one mesh, if you go to the materials buttons, you'll see at the material list at the top, both of their materials are listed. So joining them together doesn't make any of them lose their material. So undo that, and let's select the floor. Go into edit mode of the floor, select everything, press W, and subdivide this 3 times. Now what I want to do is create two materials, one for black and one for white. And I want to assign those materials to alternating squares so that we can make a checkerboard pattern. So let's add a new material and name it black. Change the diffuse color all the way down to black. Now the entire floor is black. So let's go up here to the material list and press this plus sign to add a new material slot. Now let's add a new material in that new slot. And let's name this material white. And change the diffuse color to a bright white. And the intensity value to 1 so that it's fully bright. Now let's assign them to alternating squares. Let's assign the white material to alternating squares. Let's go into face select mode by clicking that button there in the header of the 3D view. And right now, all of these faces are assigned to the black material, since that's the first material we created. Let's go through and select alternating faces. I should have subdivided it twice instead of 3 times. There we go. So with all those alternating faces selected, click on the white material and press the Assign button. And now we just assign that material to all the faces we had selected. And we're done. You can also use the Select and Deselect buttons to select any part of the mesh associated with the material you have selected. So for example, if we deselect everything and select the black material and press the Select button, it will select all the squares that have the black material. So let's get out of edit mode, go into camera view, and see what that looks like rendered. Not bad. Now there's one final detail. When you have a glass material, you kind of expect light to pass through it a little bit more freely, so the shadows won't be as dark, and the shadow should also be blue since it's blue glass. For that, we have to enable transparent shadows for the floor material. So close that, and select the black material first, scroll down to the shadow options here, and expand that panel. all you have to do is enable Receive Transparent, and the black material now is going to be able to receive transparent shadows. Now scroll up, select the white material, and do the same thing. Scroll down to the shadow panel and enable Receive Transparent. So now the entire floor is going to be able to receive transparent shadows from anything that's transparent in the scene, which is the monkey head. So let's press F12 and see how that looks now. You'll see right off the bat the shadow's blue. That's a good sign. That's a sign that's working. And it's also a lot lighter. So anything in your scene that you want to receive transparent shadows, you have to make sure to enable that option.